So thank you for inviting me again, Irina, and thanking for the NNO people for inviting me. If my count is correct, this is the 10th time that I'm participating in the Bathhouse readings. And I will say it has really opened up a completely new and different intellectual universe for me. I've learned a lot, and all the more do I feel embarrassed that it is the 10th time and I still don't speak any Russian. I mean, I'm somehow handicapped and I feel bad about it, and I apologize about it. And I hope there will be one day after my retirement, perhaps, and I can finally come back and speak some words in Russian.
By the way, it's the 10th time you apologize for not talking Russian.
Probably, but with different modifications, it gets worse and worse. So last year, this is new, for the first time in a decade, I couldn't participate in the colloquium because I was teaching in Santiago de Chile, and this was just the same weekend, the first weekend of April. And this time, this year would almost have been the second time that I couldn't have made it, because as some of you know, there is a pilot strike by Lufthansa, and it's very difficult to cross Central Europe these days. So I was at Frankfurt Airport yesterday, and for the first time in my life, I was born close to Frankfurt. I saw Frankfurt Airport completely empty, and I want to say and express my gratitude to Alexander Suslov. Without his help and his logistic genius, and I'm not exaggerating, I wouldn't be here, which maybe would be better for you, but would be worse for me. Talking of traditions, maybe that is also the 10th time that I'm saying that I try to approach the topic that you have chosen from the least politically correct possibility, from the least politically correct perspective. Now, why am I doing that? Why am I so sold on the non-politically correct perspective on the topic? Not because I think that there is some inherent truth in being non-politically correct, but because I think that there is a merit to intellectual counterpoint. If you take the opposite approach, and normally within the humanities, at least in the United States where I'm teaching, most of the humanists are extremely politically correct. So if you take the counterpoint approach, if you do what I like to call riskful thinking, you do not necessarily arrive at truth, but you normally produce a more interesting discussion. So it will be for you to do something with what I have to say from this non-politically correct perspective. Now, the topic that I've chosen that is so deliberately non-politically correct on slavery is the phenomenology and the question of the sweetness of slavery. I mean, you probably all got it when you read the title. Is there something for those involved in slavery and something for those who observe slavery that is appealing, secretly appealing to the state of slavery? Different from an egalitarian state. Is there something appealing to slavery? This is what I'm referring to by the sweetness of slavery. And by having this title with the question mark, but also as an indicative, I'm supposing, that's my working hypothesis, that there is something appealing to slavery. That's what I'm referring to by the sweetness of slavery. Now, what will be new, Irina, will be that the talk will be as short as possible. It has short, eight extremely short reflections that will lead from the first question, why is the research literature and slavery normally so boring? This is something that Jimpolsky and I agree upon. To the final question, whether there is something inherent, some remainder, some leftover of that sweetness of slavery in the present day political situations, not only situation, which I believe is the secret question that drives this colloquium. What is left of this sweetness of slavery, of this appeal of slavery in the present day political situation? So part one. Why is the literature on slavery in general, the research on slavery, so boring? I mean, you have probably made the same experience if you have prepared a lecture for this colloquium. You have looked at the corresponding websites, you've gone to the library catalog, and you find few titles that are promising. I mean, there's research covering certain phenomena. There is endless research in differentiating slavery in Russia, slavery in Brazil, slavery in the United States. There's a lot of anecdotal knowledge accumulated, but there's hardly ever a title that captures you because it has an intellectual or a philosophical promise. Now, why is this so, I was asking myself. And my answer, my tentative answer would be that the topic of slavery, intellectually speaking, is at the intersection between political indignation on the one hand and moral indignation on the one hand, and the double absence of interesting historical documents on the other hand. So when you talk about slavery, you immediately feel you have to say that slavery is a bad thing. Now, is there anything more tautological than saying that slavery is a bad thing? So you have to be indignated about slavery, but that doesn't produce any discussion, that just produces tautology. But if you don't do that, you feel bad about yourself. So this is the first problem. The problem about the documents goes like this. I mean, for the last 200 or 300 years, not only within the Western tradition, those who were in favor of slavery or those who were practicing slavery had every good reason not to talk about it. I mean, Thomas Jefferson being a good case. He was in the American government the anti-slavery champion, but throughout his life he was holding between 100 and 120 slaves in his private property in Monticello, close to Charlottesville, Virginia. You can still see his house there. But he never talked about it. He never talked about slavery except in an Enlightenment mood. So we do not know what he really was thinking about the slaves. And on the other hand, of course, and for good political reasons, practical reasons, so to speak, the slaves were illiterate. So they literally had no possibility to leave any traces, any personal traces, about how they felt about their existence. So what you have then when you talk about slavery is the obligation to moral indignation on the one hand, which is already boring, and a lack of interesting documents on the other hand. That's the first point. That makes the topic both challenging and difficult. In the second place, there's also a problem with the definition of slavery. Because, I mean, if somebody asks you on the street, how do you define slavery? You will, of course, say this is the absolute denial of agency. Agency in the sense of German Handlungsfreiheit, freedom, independence to act. But if you look closely to it, you quickly realize that such a thing as an absolute absence of agency does not exist. I mean, even a slave in the worst position has certain tiny dimensions of agency. And on the other hand, sometimes we talk about slave labor for people who have full political agency. I mean, if you are exploited in your work, you can talk about slavery. But so you have an enormous internal differentiation within the concept of slavery, and that makes it very difficult to talk about it philosophically. I mean, I completely agree with Jimpolsky. The most interesting starting point in a way is Hegel, but if you go the Hegelian point, presupposing that there is one concept of slavery, you somehow undersell the topic from a historical point of view, and this is another problem. So my third point, you see I'm going quickly.
Yeah.
My third
I'm
point,
counting,
you count, but it'll be 8, I know that for sure. My third point is the proposal of how to approach the topic from a different angle. We are normally told, but I think this is a legacy of the ideology of enlightenment, that what we are supposed to have achieved since the 18th century, since enlightenment, namely agency, liberty, equality, is natural. Now the point I want to make in my point 3 is that there's nothing less natural than agency, freedom, and equality. So I want to emphasize, and I propose this colloquium to emphasize, in order to get an access to slavery, to emphasize the improbability of the opposite. To say, in all historical societies that we know up until the 18th century, until deep into modernity, slavery was completely natural. There is no society without slavery. So the great cultural achievement, the achievement of civilization, the improbable achievement of civilization is precisely agency, freedom, egalitarianism. My starting point would be to say that normally, and that includes ourselves, if you experience other people, your starting point is always a difference. You talk about other people, you see a difference, and by doing a difference, you establish different levels. So I would say the starting point, the natural starting point, if one can use the word natural at all, in perceiving and experiencing other people is precisely an ontology of difference. As one important document, in that sense, I wanted to give you the most famous quote about slavery in the Aristotelian Politeia, where you see that for him it's natural to start with hierarchies. The first perception of the other is always a hierarchy. You relate to the other either as superior or as inferior. Naturally, you don't relate to others, even in our everyday, as being equal. So I'm quoting from Politeia, where then there is such a difference as that between soul and body, or between man and animals. That's the first distinction. So there's a difference, the distinction between man and animals, as in the case of those whose business is to use their body and who can do nothing better. So those who predominantly use their body and cannot do anything better than using their body, they're associated with animals. The lower sort are by nature slaves. Those who above all use their body are naturally slaves, and it is better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under a master. So there's a natural difference, and it's only natural and better for them that they should be under a master. For he who can be, and therefore is an other's property, so it is natural to be an other's property, and he who participates in reason enough to apprehend, this is why he's not completely an animal, he's a slave. So the first ontology in the perception by Aristotle is a natural, as he would propose it, difference. And based on this natural difference, the natural thing is not equality, agency, or freedom. The natural thing is fiefdom. The natural thing is slavery. And then, interestingly enough, in the next sentence, Aristotle begins to have some doubt about this distinction. This distinction becomes frail. And I'll read you the next sentence just as a commentary. Nature would like to distinguish between the bodies of freemen and slaves. It would be the good natural thing that they would always have the appropriate bodies, making the one strong for servile labor, that would be the slave, the other upright, and although useless for such services, useful for political life in the art both of war and peace. So he would like to see from the outside immediately, this is somebody born as a slave, and this is somebody born for a superior position. But the opposite unfortunately often happens, says Aristotle, that some have the souls and others have the bodies of freemen. Yeah, so, I mean, it presupposes that there is a natural hierarchy, and unfortunately, in the everyday perception, it sometimes gets diffused. But nature, this is the important sentence, nature would want us to be naturally different. Now, how improbable a cultural achievement, equality, agency, and freedom is, you can see if you read some of the 18th century arguments through which the abolition of slavery was achieved. You will in the first place see that they were of very different nature, they converge very strongly, and they are sometimes very far-fetched. So it is actually not completely easy to make a quote-unquote naturalistic argument against slavery. I give you a first quote. Polsky was already talking about that implicitly without quoting, and that is from Adam Smith, The Wealth of the Nations. Why is he arguing that slavery should be abandoned? Not because it is not natural, not because it is ethically bad, but because it is economically unproductive. So this is Adam Smith. The experience of all ages and nations, I believe, demonstrates that the work done by slaves, though it appears to cost only their maintenance, is in the end the dearest, meaning the most costly of any work. A person who can acquire no property can have no other interest but to eat as much and to labor as little as possible at all. Whatever work he does beyond what is sufficient to purchase his own maintenance can be squeezed out of him only by violence and not by any interest of his own. So you see, one very important argument of enlightenment against slavery is not moral or naturalistic at all. It is about property, it is about economic productivity. But if you look, for example, into the encyclopedia article on slavery by Denis Diderot, you find a completely different political argument, an interesting argument that I find completely far-fetched. It is not obvious at all, because Diderot argues, and he doesn't convince me, although in a way I agree with his tendency, that an individual is not qualified, is not capable to possess his or her own freedom. Yeah? I mean, it's a strange argument. Why would an individual not be able to possess his or her own freedom? He says only the state, the sovereign, can possess individual freedom. So this is an argument that is very successful in the 18th century, but if you think about it, I think it is not very inherently convincing. It had a great effect, and that's why we like this argument. I quote Diderot. Not only can there be no property rights, properly speaking, in persons, so persons cannot have property rights of their own freedom, it is an offense against reason to think that a man, an individual man, who has no power over his life, but who else would have power over his life, can give anyone else, either by consent or by convention, a right that is not his. So you see, the sentence is that as you do not own your own freedom, for some reason that he doesn't name, you're not qualified to own your own freedom, you can also not give it away. And then he says, every citizen's liberty is part of public freedom. So ask yourself, would you like that, to say that your own freedom is owned by the state, is owned by the sovereign? This quality, in its collective condition, is even a part of sovereignty. If liberty has a price to the purchaser, it is beyond the price to the seller. So you see, this is a strange paradoxical situation. He makes an argument in favor of the impossibility of slavery. He makes an argument in favor of individual freedom by saying that we individuals are not capable of owning our own freedom. Only the state is capable of owning individual freedom. So the bottom line is, and I finish my third part, I think a certain historical awareness of how improbable it is that slavery was ever overcome against a natural tendency to perceive difference would be a good intellectually productive approach towards slavery. Now, fourth part, what do I really mean by the sweetness of slavery? I mean, part was already alluded to when I was quoting Aristotle. When Aristotle is saying, as there are natural differences, it is naturally better for the one who basically is good at serving with his body to be possessed by somebody. There's something positive in being possessed by somebody. But does this correspond to any personal experience? I would say yes, it does correspond to a personal experience. We are all used to it, but we don't associate it with the political situation. We are all used to it by the semantics of individual love, of ecstatic individual love. But because as soon as we talk about ecstatic individual love, and not only in romantic poetry, we talk about the wish to possess and to be possessed. To introduce a first into the bathhouse readings, I would quote you 4 lines of the most famous medieval German poetry of Minnesan. And it goes like this: Ich bin dien, du bist min, in meinem Herzen ist beschlossen, verloren ist das Lützelin, du musst nun immer drinnen sein. And it means, I am yours, you are mine, it is locked in my heart, the key is lost, so we always have to be there. So you see, the desire and the expression of the ecstatic form of individual love is total possession. You possess totally the person you love, but you also want to be totally possessed by the person you love. beloved. And what I mean by totally possessed, that the key is lost. There is no reversal to it. Now you may of course say that the effect of potential slavery, because it would be a state of slavery, is neutralized by the mutuality. You possess your beloved one, and your beloved one possesses you. But I want to emphasize that in everyday language about love, there is a unilateral way of talking about that too. There is a desire of being completely possessed. There seems to be a sweetness of being completely possessed. I mean, Jean César isn't here yet, but it is interesting. The most frequent way of referring to your beloved in Brazilian Portuguese is to say o meu bem, my good. And that means two things in Brazilian Portuguese. It means my good, my wonderful, but it also means my possession. So you say to your beloved as a tender word, my possession, meaning that it is something sweet for your beloved to know that she is possessed by you. Or let's refer to this well-known French metaphor for the orgasm. It is so well-known that it is banal, but it is interesting for our case. You know that in French you can refer to the orgasm as la petite mort, the small death. And that means, of course, that the high point of neurotic experience is an experience that you give yourself so fully to the other person. So you are so fully absorbed by the other person that you no longer exist. So this being possessed has a specific sweetness to it that I would associate as a phenomenological dimension with the sweetness of slavery. Now, I'm not singing the praise of slavery here, of course. It has to say that, but I do think there is something like the sweetness of slavery. Point 5. I think the best systematic way of finding out from a political point of view, from a philosophical point of view, and I have not elaborated this systematically, but I would at least give you an impression. The best way of finding that out would be precisely to focus on the improbability of the opposite of slavery, namely agency, freedom, and equality, and to ask ourselves what would be the price, what would be the burden of agency, freedom, equality, the burden that you do not have to pay if you are in the situation of being possessed, if you are in a situation of slavery. Let me give you 4 illusions. In the first place, if you are in a position of agency, if you are free, you constantly have to make decisions in cases where you cannot have an easy deductive or inductive argument. You arrive at a moment where you have to judge, where you have to make a judgment. And the fact that in the philosophical tradition, the concept of judgment is very often related to power, because power of judgment shows you that there is a burden in constantly making judgments. So if you are a slave, you don't ever have to make judgments, and that makes your life easier, that alleviates your life. Secondly, in a situation of freedom and egalitarianism, you have to try to be equal to the others, and that means you have to compete with others. And that means you are, and this is negative for intellectuals in our intellectual language, that you have to be in a situation of competition. And being in a situation of competition is a stressful situation. Whereas if you are a slave in a quote-unquote natural hierarchy, you don't ever have to compete. Thirdly, if you are in a situation of egalitarianism and agency, you're supposed to make your own living. You cannot expect that anybody else will maintain you. I mean, this is what Adam Smith is saying. A slave has a right to expect that he is being maintained. I mean, if you are in a situation of liberty, think of the early United States, the United States today. Nobody maintains you if you are not making your own effort. You have to earn your own living, which is a burden. And finally, and I think this is once again interesting in the way of intellectual language today, if you are in a situation of agency, egalitarianism, and freedom, you are not allowed to be in any symbiotic relationship. And I find it interesting that symbiotic relationship in psycholanguage today is the most undesirable type of relationship, but I do think that there is a sweetness to symbiotic relationships, that there is a sweetness to hierarchical relationships. But if you are free and in a situation of egalitarianism, you are not allowed to ever be part of such a symbiotic relationship. Now, points 6 and 7 will be two brief historical examples, counter-examples, because I'm not competent to talk about the Russian situation, with which I want to illustrate this side of the sweetness of slavery. Once again, not because I want to argue that we should return to that state, but in order to open a discussion of how difficult it is to ultimately overcome slavery, because there is an inherent appeal and sweetness to it. My first example is Sally Hemings, a slave, and Thomas Jefferson. And it is a story that goes between 1795 and 1826. So there was a slave relationship. I mean, Sally Hemings this was the language in America those days, the concubine of Thomas Jefferson for plus minus 30 years. We did not exactly know when it was started, but we do know because this was the first child that she has of Thomas Jefferson. And it was only found out by DNA tests a few years ago. Only since DNA tests a few years ago, we know from the present-day Hemings family that they do have Jefferson genes. So until very recently, it was impossible to prove that this relationship ever took place. Okay, so in the first place, it is a very typical case for slavery as a historical case, because on the one hand, the case starts out with indignation. The first time that it is mentioned that there might be erotic relationship, a sexual relationship between Thomas Jefferson and one of his slaves was in 1802 when Jefferson was president of the United States, and it produced a huge wave of national indignation. So no judgment was made, it was just one party against the other party. And it would be a fantastic case to show how moral and political indignation is intellectually unproductive. Secondly, the case, of course, is also typical because there is a total lack of documents. Yeah? On the one hand, Thomas Jefferson never mentions Sally Hemings except in his will, in his testament. I will come back to that. She is never mentioned in any of his notes, even when in his economic notes he mentions other slaves. He does not mention her. And we can tell that the relationship must have started in the mid-1790s, because it was in the mid-1790s that he made some architectural changes to his house in Monticello so that his bedroom would become invisible from outside. So, I mean, not only are there no traces of Sally Hemings in whatever we have of Jefferson, Jefferson did everything to hide that relationship, and that, of course, is a completely typical relationship. On the other hand, we have no traces of Sally Hemings, of her experience, because although she must have been a very skillful woman, she was trusted with certain tasks in the education of Jefferson's children. She was very good at needlework, but she was, of course, illiterate, so we do not know anything about it. Now, what was, I'm asking that question, the sweetness of this relationship for Thomas Jefferson? And we do know that Thomas Jefferson had an interesting conception of slavery. In the notes on the state of Virginia, he critically talks about relationships between masters and slaves. That is precisely a non-amorphic relationship. And he very clearly spells out, 5 more minutes I will make that, he very clearly spells out there's a passion on both sides. Quote from Jefferson, "The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions." Now that is important. There are passions on both sides. The most unremitting despotism on one part, and the most degrading submission on the other. But the important thing is, and that is the implication of the sweetness of slavery, the most extreme submission is a passion too. You want to submit yourself. Now, what was the sweetness for Jefferson? We will never know what the erotic sweetness was, but we do know when Jefferson started having a relationship with Sally Hemings, he was about 50 years old. He was a widower, and he had read a book by a British doctor which said it is very bad for men in the age of over 50 to accumulate too much semen. So that is the nicest ideological description of eroticism. You have to get rid of your semen. So he had to find somebody who would regularly have sex with him. And that, of course, was ideal in the case of a slave. He could just say, you have to have sex with me as often as I need to not accumulate too much semen. So that is the only sweetness we know of Thomas Jefferson. I suppose there was more of it, but we wouldn't know. And what was the sweetness on Sally Hemings' side? We do not know anything about it, but we know one interesting thing. We know that Jefferson, in his will from 1825, he died in 1826, almost, over 80 years old, which was unusual for the time. He liberated a number of slaves. He did not give freedom to Sally Hemings. Now, this is interesting. There are probably two reasons for that. One reason, and this is very interesting, in the state of Virginia, in the early United States, you were not allowed to free a slave over 50 years, because this would have meant you just get rid of your obligation of maintenance. Yeah? This was a law in favor of a slave. A slave over 50 years could no longer be freed, because if not, you could cynically free the slave, and then the slave was there without any possibility to earn his or her living. So she was not freed by him, but she was passed on as a property to his daughter Martha Jefferson. And Martha Jefferson must have freed her, because we do know she was then a free citizen in the early 1830s in Charlottesville, Virginia. Another detail, and then I finish the Jefferson story. According to the law, the children between Jefferson and Sally Hemings would have been free, because the law was, if 2 times a white person had intervened in a genealogy, the offspring was free. And Sally Hemings was actually not 100% African American. She was the daughter of a black slave woman and of Jefferson's father-in-law. So the children between Sally Hemings and Jefferson would have been legally free, but Jefferson never declared them free in his testament. So this is interesting. So if you ask them, what is the legacy of such a case? What is the legacy of slavery in the United States? I would say a state of denial. A state of denial until the present day. Jefferson, on the one side, in the Notes on the States of Virginia, is the great champion of abolition of slavery, but he is a slaveholder. Then comes Lincoln, and you have a civil war that brings politically abolition officially. But after that, the situation of black people in many cases got worse, because they got out of slavery. Then you have the civil rights movement in the 60s, and you then feel the situation is finally taken care of. 2 more minutes. But it is not. 2 more minutes for the Brazilian case. And this is example number 7. Brazil, very different from the United States. Brazil was one of the last countries where abolition officially took place. It was the symbolic ending of the Brazilian Empire that had been founded in 1815 from an offspring of the Portuguese crown. So 1889 was the abolition in Brazil, but we know that the self-reference, the self-description of the Brazilian Empire was based on a specifically liberal, cordial relationship between slaves and owners. There is a specific word for that, and the word is cordialidade, cordiality. João César de Castro Rocha has actually written a book about that. So that there was a specifically sweet, mutually sweet relationship between masters and slaves was not only a fact in the Brazilian Empire, it was the central part of the self-identity. Now this part of self-identity received an academic, a scientific aura by a book that was published in 1933. Maybe some of you have heard about the book. It is by the famous anthropologist Gilberto Freire, and the title is Casa Grande Senzala, Aristocratic Mansion and Slave Cabin. And this book tries to describe in detail cordialidade, and it tries to describe in detail and with documents the quote-unquote sweetness of the erotic relationship between a mature black woman and normally a young master. So in this book, if you want to read this book, it is a great anthropological book. It is a classic. It is a classic that has had a huge influence on Brazilian self-reference until the present day. But it describes above all the specificity of this erotic relationship. And this, I think, is the reason why Brazilians until the present day like to present themselves as originating in a erotic relationship, as originating in a relationship whose symbolic figure is umulato. Yeah? Until the present day, in most languages you don't use that word anymore. Until the present day, umulato, as the central figure of Brazilian identity, is proverbial. This has to do, and it has to be said in the year of the Soccer World Cup, with the fact that the first time that Brazil was successful as a Soccer World Cup, not winning the Soccer World Cup, 1 minute, that's enough for the Soccer World Cup, was in 1938, the Soccer World Cup in France, when Brazil ended up third for the first time, but made the sensation. Italy won that World Cup, but everybody talked about Brazil. And then Gilberto Freire is asked in an interview why Brazil all of a sudden is so good in soccer. He said, this is because it was the first time that we played with Afro-Brazilian players. And as long as we don't play above all with mulatto players, because o mulato é o verdadeiro brasileiro, the mulatto is the true Brazilian, as long as we do not play with mulatto players, as long as we do not play the style of cordiality, we cannot be successful. This is a legacy in Brazil until the present day, a legacy which was a great difficulty and has been a difficulty for the social democratic government of Lula and Dilma today. But this legacy, that cordiality, which is a slave relationship, a slave-master relationship, is at the center of Brazilian identity, has been a legacy until the present day. How does the sweetness, do these phenomena of the sweetness of slavery survive until the present day? Well, for example, you may have read in this country that 80% of the German voters feel the German politicians should cultivate more the political style of the President of Russia. They like this style that seems to imply a certain asymmetry. They feel that their own politicians are too much concerned about public opinion. I do think it survives.
We can export him to Germany.
Well, as I'm not German, anytime. Maybe you get from American then whatever you want to get. I mean, after all, she has an Eastern German education. Secondly, I do think this is interesting. It survives. It survives in the expectation that the state has a basic obligation to take care of you. Yeah? I mean, there's a certain social democratic mentality in which the state takes over the role of the master in a slavery relationship. And I think it also survives, above all among intellectuals and academics, in this extreme prejudice against any kind of competition. Competition is naturally evil. Now, to say that competition is naturally evil, says the American citizen and myself, may be part of the legacy of slavery. And above all, I have to finish by saying I very much hope that you did not misunderstand my presentation as a pledge in favor of slavery. Many thanks.
I'll ask the question in English because I'm familiar with the literature in English. First of all, thank you, that was interesting and provocative. But if I may say so, some of the arguments were very familiar because the sort of contrast between libertarianism and paternalism is, of course, a sort of very long-standing one in Western political thought of all kinds of different levels, and it's extremely familiar, for example, in the literature relating to children, what to do about children, I mean, how children should be liberated, whether they should be allowed, for example, to choose their own parents, to choose their own religion, what the costs of that might be, and as I'm going to talk about the case tomorrow, extremely familiar also in the literature on the position of animals. So there's a lot of literature around that kind of goes around exactly the points that you're making, although with not such instructive historical examples. And I wonder whether we need to think a bit harder to get outside the box, because your arguments against the sort of usual liberationist narratives were, as I say, familiar ones, the ones that are usually made against it. So we don't seem to have got a whole lot further with what you were saying, and I was just wondering whether you would like to sort of think of some more maybe in the discussion. But to go beyond that, I mean, a couple of points that I think also need addressing. I mean, there was a lot of slippage in what you said between historical arguments used to legitimate slavery in particular cultures which happened to have slaves at the time, between arguments which have been made by historians since in order to, as it were, get themselves off the hook. I mean, I would say actually that the literature on slavery in ancient Greece is a lot more interesting than you suggest. It's much more paradoxical. It's dealing with very directly with the problem of the fact you take a thinker like Aristotle, who's traditionally seen as a foundational figure for democracy and is very obviously not trying to criticize slavery but doing the opposite. I mean, I can mention several sources on that. I mean, Garnsey's book, for example, Peter Brunt's work on slavery in ancient Greece. So there is that sort of side of things also. But I also think it's important to look more closely perhaps at the theological situation. And I mean, for example, the relationship with God, and it may not be a popular argument in this auditorium, but it does need to be addressed. Because, of course, the free will versus surrender argument is, again, extraordinarily important. And whilst in a kind of liberal Western city, and I would include Moscow as being a liberal Western city in that respect, certainly standing in this particular place, it might not be one that we find useful. I mean, it's certainly been one that has justified a particular type of paternalism, and I think is probably behind the sort of relationship that Jefferson had as well. So the notion of actually knowing better than people do for what is good for them, I mean, I think this is very often absolutely fundamental, and it certainly would have been fundamental to slave owners in the early 20th, early 19th century. And then there's finally also, I mean, the fact that, I mean, obviously you live and work mostly in the USA, and I do think the situation is very peculiar from the rest of the world's point of view there, to be honest. I mean, I think that the sort of apologetics which go on, I mean, there's deep unease about the institution of slavery there is not characteristic. In a sense, I wish there were more of it in Britain, but of course we are a slave-owning society that just simply doesn't talk about this most of the time. One of the things I thought about, speaking about at the conference, was what it's like to be in modern Britain and know that some of your ancestors almost certainly owned slaves. I mean, my mother's family suddenly got very rich at the end of the 18th century, bought a lot of extremely nice furniture, bought a mansion house. Where did that money come from? I know they had interest in the West Indies. I know they were also liberationists. It all seems to hang together. So, whilst I don't want to end on a kind of note of, sort of really dealing with that, because I don't know how to deal with it. I mean, I think in the US we have a sort of situation which has produced a particular auditorium, which is perhaps not the auditorium that you would find in other places. So, I mean, I'm afraid that's rather rambling, but I mean, there are sort of two things, one of which is, can we really only get as far as reiterating the sort of, as it were, paternalist arguments against liberationism? That's my first point. The second is, shouldn't we sort of think more widely and sort of think about other areas? I mean, not just erotic love, for example, but, for example, theological presuppositions. And thirdly, I mean, is it possible that your entire take on the subject is shaped by working in a sort of West Coast US university, and perhaps it looks rather different in other parts of the world?
No doubt about, I mean, that's the hermeneutic 101, that what I'm saying is shaped by my intellectual environment. I mean, what can I do? The second point, your second point really, yes, I mean, there are zillions of other interesting topics one could have talked about, but it's also about 20 minutes. So let me therefore just go and try to state very clearly what my argument, and rather than my argument, my proposal for the further discussion would be a hypothesis. So my main point was to argue against the naturalization of agency, freedom, equality, and some other of those wonderful 18th century words, to emphasize as much as I can that they are extremely improbable achievements of Western culture, fantastic, highly appreciated achievements of Western culture, conquest of Western culture, but thereby, and maybe that is what I didn't say enough, they are permanently frail, they're permanently fragile, they're permanently in question, they're permanently endangered of falling back into another situation. And the question is, the question which is not a rhetorical question, but maybe one of the possible questions of such a colloquium is precisely whether this counterpoint of the sweetness of slavery is a necessary counterpoint in order to achieve a permanence of agency, equality, liberty, or whether we need to become more radical and need to eliminate them. That might be the theoretically more radical, more desirable situation, but that would be the dialectical argument. Is it not necessary to have, and to a certain degree, to tolerate that counterpoint of the sweetness of slavery in order to guarantee the long-term institutionalization, survival, success of what is precisely the opposite?
I thought that there would be two different kinds of sweetness of slavery to distinguish. I mean, two different two kinds of sweetness of slavery for the slave, not for the master. The first one is the sweetness of becoming a slave, and the second one is the sweetness of remaining slavery. The first one can be related to a situation of lovers that you have mentioned, which implies a beginning of their relation, and the other seems rather that of a child whose dependency on his parents has no beginning conscious for him, who lives on independence. So there are two different sources of real slavery, that you said, which should be distinguished, even if they can combine with the life of a single person, of a single nation.
No, that's a very productive distinction. Let me just turn it into my own situation. As you were speaking about the U.S. and how different the U.S. are in so many ways, the previous speaker. I mean, the United States, different from most European, Central European countries at least, are a country without mandatory retirement. And they're also a country where, whichever situation you work, what you will get in terms of a pension from your employer, from the state after your retirement, is definitely not enough to survive. Meaning that for many Americans at the age of retirement, there is a desire of a permanence of the sweetness of slavery. Yeah? You would love a situation where you are no longer economically productive, but where some master, and that master is the state, capital S, would take care of you for a lifetime. I do think there's a moral right to that. I do think it's an interesting position, but it is basically, and this is what I find interesting about your distinction, it is basically a situation that is in contradiction with the radical claims of independence and agency. I mean, if you're consequent with the radical claim of agency, you cannot claim that anybody, except, I would say, an account in which you have paid, that other people's taxpayer money take care of you in a moment where you become economically non-productive. Very American argument, but it is about argumentative consistency.
Thank you very much. Following a little bit from what Katriana has been talking about, I just wonder whether when you talk about agency, freedom, and equality, and you take them as the starting point, and then questioning the natural order of those categories, I wonder whether it's not actually a little bit like setting up a straw man for your critique, because the fact that these categories are not a historical but they are more contextual. They are not absolute, but there are different degrees to which they play out. If we take, for instance, if we don't talk about them normatively, therefore avoid the normative trap that you were talking about earlier, but we look at them in empirical reality, we always talk about a certain degree of agency, a certain degree of freedom. I mean, in my own work, I work with refugees and migrants, and that's why I'm here at this conference, because the modern refugee resettlement process, etc., quite often takes place of forms of modern slavery, right? And at the same time, nobody would deny the agency of the forced migrants, a degree of the agency. That's why these are, I think, quite well rehearsed arguments.
I mean, if you, once again, I mean, this was I think, my last sentence. If you thought this was a pledge in favor of slavery, obviously not. And it was also not meant to be a critique of agency, equality, freedom. No. The critique was against the naturalization thereof. I think one of the interesting streaks of discussion, arguments of this colloquium might be to talk about the improbability of those achievements. But by improbability, I mean that they're all the more to be appreciated. But they are more precarious than we normally think. And this could be the emphasis. So what are the temptations? What are the temptations of the other situation? We have a black and white situation where we have freedom, etc., etc., this whole register saying that's natural, that's what people naturally like to do. So we seem to assume that once you have established a situation where this is possible, it gets immediately established. But we know until deep into our 21st century, this is not the case. I would say the latest, the most recent round of disappointments is the so-called Arabic Spring. Okay, now they liberated themselves from dictatorial, totalitarian situations, and now everything is going to be better. No, in most cases, things are not naturally better. And I would say, to just say, oh, you know, you once again had an evil dictator who was manipulating people, that is too easy. This is precisely what I would say a polymorphic situation, where what I was maybe too polemically calling, quote unquote, the sweetness of slavery comes in and plays a role. Right? Precisely, it is very challenging, it is very demanding, it's a discomfort in many situations to embody agency, equality, and independence. And this, I think, is a perspective that we normally underestimate. So, I think precisely, and this seems to be the one point we certainly emphatically agree upon, there should be a greater awareness of these positive concepts as normative concepts instead of naturalizing them.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, and so I'll just say a few words, just probably one word. By the way, it's very interesting. You know, there were quite a lot of discussions in antebellum South, just a decade before the abolition of slaves. And there appeared huge philosophical trends of defending, you know, trying to find philosophical ground for you know, this natural cause of slavery. And they created quite a lot of interesting and sophisticated methods. By the way, many of them very much like you produced, you know, discussing this erotic side of slavery, philosophical, and by the way, appealing to the Bible and to the moral conditions in a way. So I think it's rather peculiar and interesting. Of course, it's absolutely disappeared after the Civil War, but that was, you know, proliferating quite a lot of philosophical treatises, you know, finding ways of speaking about slavery from this enchantment and positive side of it.
And once again, I mean, one last time, because that may be my last opportunity, not by any means to reintroduce that as being impeding. No, the argument has to be, I don't like the word dialectical, but...
No, we understood it. No one suspects you.
Okay, then